Well, hello and welcome to another Dig Deeper. It's great to be with you today. Hi, Stephen. You're looking toasty and warm.
I've had the space heater on in preparation, and I've had a little cup of port, so I'm all warm and toasty now.
It's been quite a week.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, what a week for somebody whose profession is to talk about patriotism and Christianity.
Yeah, and politics and nationalism.
Oh, I can't get away from it. Other people get the luxury of just ignoring it or pretending it doesn't happen to them, but it happens to me. I can't ignore it. I get emails asking me to comment.
And you literally can't escape because it's also lockdown 2.0 in the UK. So you're on both flanks. You're being pinned down.
Yeah. I don't mind it. The lockdown business, I'm not pretending it's wonderful, but I am not afraid of having my life stopped for a little bit. I think there's something good that happens when the space is cleared, and it does come with problems. There's financial problems and whatnot, but so I'm not making light of it, but I'm also not in despair because of it.
No. Yeah. I'm actually in a different place myself. I've been on retreat this week and trying to hit reset on a lot of things. So it seems appropriate that as we hit lockdown 2.0 that I'm thinking, how do I want to live my life differently? And I've been reading a John Mark Comer book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and talking about what it means to be followers of the way of Jesus. And which is what we've been talking about throughout the course of our time together, is looking at Mark's gospel and what is it that Mark challenges us about the life of Jesus. And the thing that struck me in the book that I was reading is he talks about being attracted by the way that Jesus lived. But in order to get there, we need to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus in order to have the life of Jesus. That's how, look at how Jesus lived, and then you'll get the life of Jesus. And that's what we're seeing today in Mark's gospel.
But isn't that absolutely relevant to the very first story we want to look at?
Yeah.
Which is Jesus in the storm.
Yeah. Here we are. I mean, we've got the storm happening around us right now.
Yeah, right. So what we're going to do, John, for this, because we want to look at the last section of chapter 4 and then all of chapter 5.
Yeah.
We're not going to read through the whole thing like we do in the past, are we?
Yeah, it's too long, and we want to give as much time as we can, because they're 3 significant stories. Remind us what they are.
So let's talk very briefly, because you brought it up, and it's a good story about Jesus and the storm. And then we're going to talk about the legion, the Jesus going over and casting the legion out of the person. And then we're going to talk about probably my favorite story in the whole Bible, probably, is the story of the woman who was bleeding for 12 years.
Okay.
Raising of Jairus' daughter. So
yeah. How do you want to tackle these 3 stories? What would you like to do?
Well, why don't I just read what I think is the key little nugget or verse from each of those stories.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about it a bit.
And maybe give some summary around each
Exactly. They're well-known stories. That's the other thing. This contains stories that even people who don't know anything about Jesus know about these stories, right?
So if you want to follow in scripture, we're looking at Mark chapter 4, beginning at verse 35, and we're going all the way through to the end of chapter 5. That's why it's a long section. So go for it, Stephen.
Well, the obvious one, so Mark 4:35 involves Jesus getting on a boat with his disciples, and other boats were with him. So it's a little fleet of boats, actually. And a great windstorm arises, and he's sleeping on a pillow in the stern. And they rouse him and say, "Teacher, does it not matter that we are perishing?" And he calms the storm, and then he says, "Why are you so afraid? How is it you have so little faith?" Famous story.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's the first story at the end of Mark chapter 4.
So let's talk about that for a second.
All right.
This is the rest story, that Jesus is asleep. Well, first of all, have a look at verse 38. There's a little nugget here. Jesus is asleep on a pillow.
Yeah, which until you read that, I don't think I'd ever seen it.
So
it's so funny how much we miss, isn't it, when we already presume we know the story. I think sometimes growing up in, as you know,
Yeah.
Growing up in a Christian world, you know, where we've heard these stories, we've coloured in Jesus on the boat before, you know, they're so familiar that it's almost, you know, familiarity breeds contempt kind of thing. You know, we forget what's in there. And I don't think I'd clocked as an adult that there he was sleeping on a cushion in the version I've got in front of me.
Like theology nerds, Bible study or Bible scholars, nerds, they love this verse because it's one of the details of, it's one of the verses that has like eyewitness detail in it. And so Bible nerds love these bits because they don't add to the story.
Yeah.
But they show some kind of awareness of presence, of being there in the moment. And so it's used often as an example of linking perhaps Peter to being the eyewitness to these events.
Okay.
Peter, who's known to travel with Mark. We don't know for sure that Mark wrote the gospel. Nobody says, I, Mark, write these words. But this gospel has been associated with Mark for a long time, right back to ancient church history. And Mark was one of Peter's traveling companions. And there is like a pretty strong argument for saying, yeah, this is some of the evidence for Peter being the eyewitness to this material. And there's these little fun things about the pillow that doesn't matter. And later on, you're going to see people swarming over the green grass, that vivid green grass. And there's just little nuggets of like eyewitness detail. And that's, people like that kind of stuff. I'm going to drink port while you talk.
Okay. That will also keep you warm.
Yeah.
I think the thing I was commenting on was that it adds to that, I think, the authenticity of the account.
Yes.
When someone adds something in that's essentially frivolous,
it's
got no significance to it, other than if you were trying to make something up, why would you add that detail in? You wouldn't. You just stick to the main and the plain.
Exactly. And there's some other fun things is that if you remember that Mark reads very much like somebody telling a live story. It sounds very much like somebody's captured the live version of somebody telling a story. So, do you have any stories or anecdotes in your family tradition that gets told every year or all the time at the same? Do you know what it feels like to watch your uncle or your father or your mother tell a well-known anecdote, and you know what's going to come, and everybody sort of has heard it before, but hearing it again is part of the fun or part of the tradition. There's something of that in some of these stories. Some of the details, sometimes characters get named that don't need to be named, and you can actually almost hear the little cheers of, yay, you mentioned Silas. Yay, you mentioned the pillow. And it's like little details which almost could be part of the experience of hearing it live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, when detail gets added in like that, as a storyteller, you're doing that to enable people to be immersed in it. It's more than just
kind of funny. It's also kind of humorous.
Well, and it goes to prove the point about the fact that he was so relaxed.
Yeah, that's exactly.
He had a nice pillow to keep him while they're all freaking out. He's like, I'm chill. I'm so chill. I've got a pillow.
I don't think the pillow is theological, but the big theological kicker comes at the end of this story.
Okay.
Because he then sits up and he rebukes the wind. So he used, by the way, the word rebuke in verse 39.
Yeah.
It's the same word you'd use for exorcise the demon. So when he rebukes the demon or he rebukes the wind, and later on he's going to rebuke Peter, by the way.
Yeah.
It's always the same. He rebukes the wind and he tells it to be silent. And then everybody says, and then he says, why are you so afraid? Do you have so little faith? And then they are enormously astonished and afraid. Who is this man that even the wind and the sea obey him? This is one of those links of Jesus back to the creation. This is one of those times where Mark wants you to know that Jesus is connected back to nature. He does a nature miracle. He has power over creation because creation belongs to him. And it's one of those contested spheres that Jesus shows his lordship over. So it isn't a Jesus is just a good teacher moment. This is, oh, wait a second.
Yeah.
This guy is bringing order out of chaos. The wind and the waves is chaos, and the Holy Spirit brings order.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Jesus says, "You have little faith," or why are you so afraid? Don't you have faith? Or why are you so afraid? You have faith. Why are you so afraid when you're in the presence of faith right now, kind of thing? Which is the idea that, remember, faith doesn't mean that you can visualize in your head. If you wish hard enough, it becomes true. Faith has to do with proximity to the person. So he's basically saying, why are you so afraid? You're right here. You're with me. The people who are in the boat with Jesus are right in the center of creation right now, and they shouldn't be. It is not that they're having little faith because they are basically not living appropriately with the person that they're sitting next to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then they cross over. Now there's a significance. We're going to go into chapter 5 now, unless you have something. Is there something you want to talk about with the wind and the waves?
Well, I'm just curious as to what that, we often talk about being a follower of Jesus is to be like an apprentice. You become like the one who you're following. And we expect the same, don't we, over, particularly in charismatic circles, we'll talk about that in terms of, Jesus is someone that healed in the power of the Spirit. So we should do likewise. Jesus preached and taught. We should do likewise. We don't often have that same narrative, do we, about him having authority over creation in the same way. I don't think we don't send people out to say, next time there's a storm coming, rebuke it,
Right.
And I'm curious about that, whether that's...
Yeah. I mean, literally, that isn't what... When Jesus sends out his disciples, he gives them authority over demons and sickness, but he doesn't actually say...
That's true.
And bust storm clouds. That's true. That's a good point. I mean, it is interesting that it's the fear that the disciples are... What they're supposed to do is not fear these things. It's not that they're supposed to control them.
Yes.
So that would be like our right relation to King Jesus is not to also command the winds and the waves. It's to not fear the winds and the waves.
And it's not that... it's not that the lack of fear or the absence of fear is because it's not because there's nothing to be afraid of.
No.
It's courage is being able to face the fear that is there. It's not.
I think it's relevant to, even you just mentioned this earlier, like that it seems to be relevant to today when we feel in turmoil about coronavirus and Trump and Brexit and whatever. We feel in turmoil. And actually, that's a really valid way of reading this, because Mark is writing as a pastoral letter to his people. We always kind of, you got to remember that the Gospel of Mark is being written to a generation of a church that's been in operation for a whole generation by now. He's not writing in the white hot heat of the ink is not, he hasn't watched Jesus still the storm and then write it down and then give it to you. 70 years have passed, and he's writing within the first or second generation of Christians, and he is actually reminding them, look, we are facing turmoil right now because they're under persecution. The Mark church, the church that Mark was writing for, was under persecution. They were being kicked out of the synagogues and being cursed by their Hebrew brothers. The Mark church thought of themselves as Hebrews, and they were being kicked out of their synagogues, and they were being persecuted by Rome as well. So they were under enormous stress and persecution. And Mark puts in his story about the wind and the waves as part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been reflecting on personally is how much I don't like it when I'm out of control.
Right.
And one of the things I've reflected on is, someone said to me, but John, you don't seem all that, you don't seem like someone that has a problem with control. You seem so laid back. And my reflection is that actually, just because I'm laid back and I walk into a situation where I'm not like frenetic about everything being just as I imagine it, that's not because I don't have, it's not because I'm not wanting control. It's that I'm so comfortable within my control within my gifts, within my skill sets, that actually it's a very subtle but very clear sense that I'm absolutely dependent on my control in a situation, even though it might look from the outside like I am laid back and just whatever will be. Right. Actually, it's much more to do with the fact that I walk in, and because I'm very much in control within myself.
Yeah.
And so when this passage actually speaks of the disciples being out of control.
Yeah.
They're in a situation where they do not know what to do. And I think, I had an example recently in my own life. I won't bore you with the long story, but essentially we were trying to apply for schools for our son. Right. And we were at the end of the deadline, and I submitted my application form, which I'd done last minute, and because it only just became apparent we could apply for this particular school, and I had 24 hours to get the application to the school. Yeah, right. So I sent it via Royal Mail and paid 20 quid for the privilege to make sure it absolutely got there on time. And sure enough, they lost it.
Yeah.
And what that did for my issues of control was really revealing. And so much so that my wife said to me, she said, listen, Royal Mail's lost it. We're just going to have to trust God with this. And when she said that, me of little faith couldn't cope with it.
Yeah,
I couldn't cope with the fact that she said, just trust God, because I'd lost control. And I think what this passage speaks to me about is actually what is control in our lives, and what are we really trusting God with? Or are we just trusting God within the perimeters of the things that we can already do? What happens when we genuinely lose control, as the disciples did in this particular passage?
Okay. So you know how I say, like, we've forgotten this a bit, but we gotta. So if you start to think like a New Testament Christian, you start to associate the Holy Spirit with creation.
Okay.
So we've kind of lost that a bit, but you got to remember the Holy Spirit is the agent of creation. He's the one who's present with creation. Then Jesus says, I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit, and it's my spirit. So Jesus is giving us the spirit of creation. What is one of the fruits of the Spirit? Self-control.
Okay.
And here you've just made the link. The disciples are out of control, and they aren't noticing that they're in the presence of the spirit of creation right now.
Who is in control.
And so the chaos, the panic that comes from being out of control means you're out of touch. You're not enjoying the fruits of the Spirit right now. Yeah.
We've got a question come in, and someone wanted to ask, is it relevant at this point to talk about the link to Jonah falling asleep in the boat? And it calming by God after Jonah enters the sea. Is there a connection here with the way that the Jonah story is told with the story that we see?
That's a really good question. The first thing I'll say is I don't know. I haven't done that research on that. But the second thing I'll say is you might be right, because Jonah is a very important figure for Jesus. So in other places in the gospel, he'll talk about the sign of Jonah. This generation.
Let's talk about that. That's great that our questioner asked that, because that's not necessarily apparent in this passage, right?
Right, which is why I don't know. I can't say yes, but I'm not going to say no.
Yeah.
Because Jonah is a really important figure. And the book of Jonah is only 2 pages long. And yet Jesus refers to Jonah elsewhere in other gospels. He refers to Jonah quite a lot, more than other prophets. And he talks about the sign of Jonah. And the sign of Jonah, Jesus is connected to Jonah a lot. And so think about this. Think about, what did Jonah do? So first of all, he was thrown into the sea in the belly of the fish. And then 3 days later, he came up.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a resurrection element here.
And Jonah is, of course, a prophetic book, isn't it? It's not.
Jonah was a prophet. So what did Jonah do? Who was he a prophet to?
Nineveh.
Who was Nineveh? Do you know who Nineveh was at the time of Jonah being written? Nineveh was the empire that had overruled, that was occupying the Israelites. They had taken the Israelites into slavery when Jonah was written. So Jonah is a story about a prophet who's sent to the Ninevites. and it was written in a time when the Ninevites had taken over the Israelites. What did Jonah preach to the Ninevites?
God's grace, wasn't it?
And what did the Ninevites do in the story? They repented.
They did repent, yeah.
And what did Jonah do?
He didn't like it very much.
He didn't like it very much. And he went, I knew you'd do this, God. I knew that you make it rain on the just and the unjust. I knew that you'd forgive our enemies. I didn't want to come and preach to them because I knew you would do this.
Yeah.
And Jesus later on says, I'm the sign of Jonah, right? There's the resurrection story, but there's also, I'm the guy who's, the Hebrews are living under Roman occupation, but I'm here to preach to my enemies, right? I'm not here to destroy my enemies. And the sign of Jonah is very similar. Like the people who most hate Jesus in the New Testament are basically Jonah types who are angry that God is going to have grace on everyone. So there is a real strong Jonah connection, even to the extent that have you ever been, did I tell you this before? I can't remember if I told you. When I went in the catacombs in Rome, did I tell you about this?
No.
That I went on a little tour underneath the buried catacombs, the burial sites for the Christians. And it wasn't just Christians buried underground, it was everybody. And the tour guide, she's showing us the different tombs, and she's going, that's a Christian tomb, that's a pagan tomb, that's a Christian tomb. And we couldn't tell. I was looking for crosses or fishes, but there was no symbolism that I could recognize. And I asked her, I said, how can you tell so easily? And she said, oh, all the Christian tombs have a picture of somebody standing with their arms up like that, which is worship, which is, by the way, charismatic worship. But it's also Jonah. And this was the image of Jonah being vomited out, and he stands on the beach.
Dripping.
And it was the Christians' code for resurrection. They used the sign of Jonah as their symbol for Jesus because it was like a secret code they could use.
Wow.
Which is also about Jonah preaching to the enemies and God showing forgiveness. Yeah. Wow. So anyway, that's a diversion. It's not an answer to the very good question, which I don't know, but it is a nice diversion into Jonah.
But it is, because it comes up in the Gospels anyway, so it's exactly. Helpful.
Yeah, I really recommend, by the way, this is a good plug. Easily the best book I've read in the last 5 years is a book called Sympathy for Jonah by David Benjamin Blower, who some of you might know is the host of the Nomad podcast, one of the hosts. Okay. But he's a musician, and he's also like a really good writer and sort of biblical scholar who wrote Sympathy for Jonah. It's so thin. I mean, you can read it in a day, but it's such a good book.
Amazing.
Anyway,
right, we're a third of the way through. What's the next story?
So the next story is is another creation story, believe it or not, or another story of Jesus showing his authority. Now this is interesting, because I mentioned Jonah going to the enemies. This is Jesus going to the Romans. That's a very interesting link. I wonder if there is a connection here. Anyway, chapter 5, they go over to another part of this. They cross the lake. And what us moderns miss is that which the early readers of Mark, the first readers of Mark, would not miss this at all, is that Jesus is now in a Gentile region. That the town he's in, the Gerasenes, the region of the Gerasenes, is a Gentile region. Okay.
So before they got on the boat in Mark chapter 4,
yeah,
that was a Jewish region, and they get on the boat and they travel across through a storm.
They travel through a storm and they go to a Gentile region.
To the Gentiles. Okay.
And Mark's not hiding this. It's not a code. It's not a trick. There's no secret knowledge here. It's just a Gentile region. It's like, and they were in Kensington, in London, and they went to Waitrose, and then they got on the tube and they went to Birmingham, and they went to Greg's and had a pasty. It's like two different cultures, different regions. It's associated with different things. Okay, so now we were in Jewish land, and now we are in Gentile land. Not only Gentile land, the Romans, when they occupied the region, they occupied everybody, right? They didn't just occupy the Jews. They occupied all the groups of people that were there.
So if you were non-Roman,
yeah,
were you with? Because that's helpful actually. If you're non-Roman, you were also, I guess, oppressed by the Romans. Okay, I'd not thought of it like that.
Samaritans were occupied by the Romans just like the Jews were, right?
Okay.
And all these people groups, all these Mediterranean tribes are being oppressed by the Romans altogether, right? And they go over to one of these non-Jewish towns, and this town this region in the Gerasene region also had a Roman fort there. It was also known as a place where there was an uprising, and the Romans had come and squashed the uprising and built a big fort there. So it's a military industrial complex region associated with Gentiles and Romans. All right. And Jesus shows up and he meets a chaotic man who's infested with demons. And you remember how earlier Jesus was in a synagogue and he casts out a Jewish demon, right? Well, now he's in a Gentile region and he finds another man with a demon and he asks the guy, what's your name? What name does he give? Legion. So if you're a Roman occupied Palestinian sheep herder and you hear the word legion, what do you think? What do you hear? Roman soldier, right?
Yeah.
So this is Mark telling you, oh, we saw Jesus casting out Jewish demons. Now he's going to cross the water and now he's going to cast out a Roman demon. Jesus is Lord of the Jewish world and he's Lord of the Gentile world and the Roman world. It's a very deliberate move into a whole new area, and it's starting to show that Jesus is more than just king of the Jews. Okay, so that's one of the main things, and you get some more examples here. Verse 7, he cries out with a loud voice and says, "What do you and I have with one another, Jesus, Son of the God? I command you by God not to torment me, or I adjure you. I request that you do not torment me." And Jesus said, "Come out of the man, you impure spirit." This is one of those another examples of in the early mindset, the early first century world, if you knew somebody's name, you had control over their destiny.
Yeah.
Right. So this is part of that whole story of Jesus not wanting demons to say his true identity. And he's like, "No, you don't get to tell me my destiny.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to get your name." They said, "You're the Son of the Most High God." And he goes, "Shut up. What's your name?" And they go, "Oh, we're Legion." So he's now got command over their destiny.
Okay.
And it's a Roman name and it's associated with soldiers and all that represents. And
it's a vivid description, isn't it?
Yeah, very vivid.
Very vivid description of what this man's behavior was like.
Yeah. And he's chaotic. He has no self-control. And he's out in the worst place in the world. He's in a graveyard and he's been totally set apart from everybody.
And do you think Mark has done that deliberately in terms of setting to one, side by side there, the idea of the storm in physical storm and then the storm within somebody here?
It's part of the same thought. Yeah. It's the chaos. It's the wildness. Some of the same words are the same, like he's using the same kind of words to describe storm and sea that he then describes the wild man in the graveyard. So he is making a connection. Yeah. Jesus is making order come out of chaos in all these different spheres of life, for sure.
What's interesting here is that the voice, the demon's voice, recognizes the power of Jesus in a way the disciples didn't earlier.
Yeah, I know. Well, always. The disciples, one of the things you have to remember about Mark is that the disciples are almost never an example of how to be a disciple. Like even demons.
Gives us all hope.
Yeah. Like Samaritans are good disciples. Prostitutes are good disciples. Demons understand who Jesus is. Basically, everybody you meet in the New Testament or in the Gospel of Mark is a better disciple than the disciples. That's
And
just
yet the church is built upon the ones that seem to fail over and over again.
yeah. And so, but remember, Mark is actually a manual for discipleship. So this is even part of the literary trick he's doing. He makes his heroes to be the fools. But Peter was one of the eyewitness testimonies that Mark is based on, which means that Peter is very humble and he's allowing himself to be cast as an idiot. He's an absolute idiot in Mark. He never gets it right. Which
again speaks again to the authenticity of the gospel itself, because you wouldn't make that up. You wouldn't make that the future leader of the church.
Yeah.
If you were going to make that, you wouldn't make Peter come across in the way he does.
No, it's not a hero worshipping story of a guy who was a real hero. And so I think it's evidence of Peter being humble and laying down his life. It's evidence of him not clutching tightly to his own rights. And he's puncturing the celebrity bubble. Yeah. I think it's, if Peter is the person behind the book of Mark, then it speaks very highly of his character. But
yeah.
And I think he is the voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's this very vivid stuff, which is frankly just a good story. It's just a fun story as well, right? Remember, this is the kinds of stories people would have heard around after dinner. They push the plates away and they go, Peter, tell us about the guy in the and then Mark is sitting there going, Peter's going to die soon. I better write this stuff down.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you're a vegetarian, this is not your favorite story in the Bible.
Yeah, so I mean, it is mysterious about pigs. So there's two things. We're not going to get to the bottom of the mysterious pigs. I will tell you that for sure. One thing is a guy named Walter Wink, who's a very good writer, the powers and principalities and spirit life in the New Testament. And he makes the observation, he says, isn't it interesting? Spirits they're always connected to physical beings in the New Testament. They're never just free floating. Even these demons had to be to a herd of pigs. So he says, like, there's an intimate connection between the different world. He doesn't think of it as like supernatural and natural world. He says we've got to think of it as two sides to the same coin kind of thing.
Yeah, because you don't get that sense. That's true. I'd not thought of it like that. Where Jesus is talking to the air. He's talking to or through something physical. I'd not thought of that before.
And all spirits, the impure spirits always need to be rooted in something, a town or a region or a person or a synagogue or pigs. So that's one thing that's going on. Oh, by the way, the pigs is another clue that this is not a Jewish miracle. There wouldn't be pigs in a Jewish village.
Yeah, okay.
So that's the one little point about that. There's another point about it is that, you know how like our prosperity gospel culture or cultures that are influenced by prosperity gospel, we immediately think that like following Jesus will lead to it will benefit local businesses and the whole like way of life and the standard of living for everyone will rise if you are a follower of Jesus, and that we bless our towns by being prosperous and all this kind of nonsense. There's quite a lot of evidence in the New Testament of Jesus making people's economic lives worse. And that followers of Jesus end up making bad economic decisions, or they negatively affect the local economy. So, and this is one of them. And the idea is that Jesus is disrupting life. And it's very similar to when he says, look, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword. And he doesn't mean violence. He means like people are going to be divided because of me. It's not all one big happy clappy, everyone shouting in one voice. Like mothers and daughters will be set against each other. Fathers and sons aren't going to agree with each other. Like I'm a dividing line. I'm a line in the sand.
Yeah.
Life doesn't just tick over as normal when I'm around. And this is one of those things. The villagers lose their livelihood and they ask Jesus to leave.
Yeah. Someone actually had a question about that verse in verse 17 just now. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region.
Yeah.
And the person was asking what the link is between that and verse 10, where it says, and he, my name is Legion, he replied, for we are many. and he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area.
Yeah.
Is there a link between those two verses?
Well, yeah. I mean, the link is that most people I've said this before, but most people in the Gospels who meet Jesus reject him and want him to go away.
Yeah.
So the Gospels are a highly biased set of documents. They want you to think that Jesus is God. And even the Gospels don't hide the fact that most people who met him rejected him.
Yeah.
This is another one of those stories that Jesus is sending the demon out of the land, and the people kind of would rather have the demons than Jesus. Right? So there's the connection of the two words.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they would rather have the demons and their livelihood than Jesus and no livelihood.
I mean, 2,000 pigs.
Oh, it's a big deal.
It's a big deal. That would have, I mean, the whole town would have known about it.
Yeah, but we're about to get a story of the feeding of the 5,000. So Jesus could have fed them as well. Like there's all sorts of could have, should have, would have. Like, who knows? You'd be like, oh, you lost your pigs, but my disciples are going to create a bunch of food for you now. Who knows? That never happened. We don't know what happened, but we do know that this is a story of Jesus showing his authority over a Roman demon or demons, and the people who witness it do not doubt that they don't doubt what they've seen, and they reject Jesus anyway.
They don't want it.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, is this the first time Jesus is relatively proactive about saying to people, go and tell people what's happened to you? At the end, he says, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how much he has had mercy on you.
Yeah, John, I think you're right. I think if you look at go to your house, to your own family, and report them, you might be right. That might be the first time he tells people, because in the past he's told people don't do it.
Right, that's why it stands out to me.
It is interesting that being a disciple of Jesus being a follower of Jesus doesn't necessarily mean like leaving your homeland and following him. Because Jesus says, because the guy begs him, he says, I want to be with you, verse 18.
Mm.
And Jesus says, no, I want you to go and be a missionary in your homeland.
What's the Decapolis?
That's the region of 10 cities or 10 towns.
Oh, okay.
It was a region known for 10 Roman towns.
So I suspect what I guess would have happened is 2,000 pigs went over.
Yeah.
And word got around these 10 towns, and the man at the center of it all was then asked to tell his story.
Yeah, I mean it serves a similar function here in Mark that the Samaritan, the woman at the well, serves in John, which is very early on in the gospel. There is a foreigner or a foreigner who gladly receives the Jesus and then spreads the news to non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So here in Mark 4 it happens, or in Mark 5 it happens, and in John it happens with the woman in the well. I think that's John 3. I can't remember exactly, but very early on, and that's quite part of the story, is that the Jesus's own people are less receptive than foreigners are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that strikes me before we move on to the third and final part of our time together is the man goes to the 10 cities, the region of 10 cities, to say what Jesus had done for him. Yeah. And it says, and all the people were amazed.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that difference, isn't it? The people wanted Jesus gone when it came to the cost. But when it came to him doing something for them, they were amazed or astounded. And I just think how true that is. Actually, we quite like the Jesus that gives us stuff, like a vending machine. You've been set free. That's amazing. Oh, but we don't like the fact that it might cost us something in the process.
We don't have to have you here. Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, there is some interesting human psychology going on in these.
Yeah.
And they're not tied up. They're just presented. They're not like all tied up with a neat bow.
No.
People act with They are complicated in there. Even in the sketches you get in Mark, the people have a complicated life.
But as we are in our response to Jesus, I think we like the obvious bits, and we don't like if he told us to sell everything we have and follow him. You talk about being, economically bad news if you're a follower of Jesus. The fact that he told them just to take nothing with them for the journey.
Oh yeah,
it's just like that's bad planning.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And for that matter, give someone your tune. If they ask you for a shirt, yeah.
Yeah, I know. And in the book of Acts, when the Christianity starts to take root in Ephesus, there's a whole riot because they can't sell their silver idols anymore. They were ruining the livelihood of a whole city, and there was a riot. So anyway, they weren't.
Third and final story.
The city.
Where are we at now? Third and final story.
So there we go. So now we get, then Jesus crosses over again. So he's Jewish land, Gentile land, and now he's back in Jewish land, okay? He's jumping back and forward.
Without a storm this time.
Yeah, there's no storm this time. There's a great crowd around him. Do you remember, I've talked about the ochlos before?
No.
So the ochlos, the word shows up a lot in Mark. It's the ochlos, and in English we'll call it the crowd or the great crowd. And they're actually kind of a character unto themselves in the Gospel of Mark. And the ochlos were it wasn't the word you'd use for any old crowd. It's a word you'd use. There was a specific type. It was kind of like the savage illiterate mob. You know how like the Daily Mail will complain about feral children on feral estates and that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay.
Like that. It's like it's like a group of people that are seen
jobs
and we're scared of them, and they're fierce and they're barbarian. It's that's what the ochlos are, okay? And Mark wants you to know that that's the group that Jesus was most associated with.
Mm-hmm.
The ochlos were Jewish, but because they were illiterate, they didn't have the law. And so Pharisees would say, if you hang out with the ochlos, you're unclean. So Jesus is always with the ochlos. They're always with him. And they're going to start touching him in a bit. So we're going
to... And that takes us back to something we talked about maybe last week or the week before, where actually to be socially excluded was usually because of something that you...
Right.
That you either a disability or some kind of social exclusion, which was at its root within a Jewish understanding was about sinfulness, wasn't it?
Right. So the ochlos are like a shame. They're a group of people that are a shame on the nation.
Yeah. Because of their sin.
And they're sinful because they're so illiterate and savage, they don't even know the law at all. So yeah, they're just like a mark of shame, and they're a shameful group, and they make you unclean to be with them. And Jesus is with them. And so people will say, oh, when we're going to meet this woman who's been bleeding, and when she touches Jesus's cloak, she makes him unclean. Like, no, he was unclean a long time before she ever showed up, because he was with these people.
Yeah.
Well, he was just with a Roman Gentile demon-possessed guy in a graveyard, and he was touching that guy. And then he was with pigs. So Jesus is like, he's so outside of purity.
Yeah, okay.
Like, Jesus he is totally impure, quote unquote, okay? And we have to know this. He's not some good Jew who's keeping the law. Whenever there's like a chance for purity, Jesus runs the other way.
Purity, because Jesus is Jesus trying to redefine purity?
He's going to do it here, actually, but it's not like he says impurity is a really bad idea. He just says, I'm going to define who's pure and who's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what have we got here?
So then you got the great crowd, and they're pressing around him. And then, so imagine the scene. There's a great crowd of people. They're ochlos. And then, verse 22, one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus comes by. Now, Jairus is an elite figure. All right. So the ochlos are the poor. Jairus is elite. He's really rich. The ochlos would have seen him as somewhat of an enemy, actually. or he was just so noble and so elite that he was probably part of their problem rather than their solution. And he's showing a bit of bravery because he's now willing to associate with Jesus and the ochlos.
And humble himself.
And he humbles himself. So Jairus is a good guy here, okay? But he's not, the ochlos wouldn't have seen him as a good guy. They would have seen him as one of their oppressors. And he humbles himself to Jesus. So he's a good guy. And he says, look, I've got my little daughter. Please come and lay your hands on her so she might be healed. So the little daughter, so Jairus has a little girl, and we're going to learn later that she's 12 years old. So she's a virgin. She hasn't had her period yet. She's got a man to speak for her. She's got her father to speak for her. She's basically the highest of the high. In terms of purity, she is as pure as you can get. All right? So you have to remember that. So a little girl got a man to speak for her, and her father is a synagogue ruler. And he says, and so now the whole crowd, and he went with him, and the large crowd followed him and pressed in around him. Verse 24. So imagine the scene. The crowd of people are now moving, this movement here towards this little girl, right? The highest of the high. And he went with him, and a woman enduring a flow of blood for 12 years shows up. Now, I'm so sorry if I'm repeating myself, but do you know about the levels of Jewish purity? Have I ever done that?
No, go for it.
So a Jewish man can talk to another Jewish man. All right, that's fine. Jewish man can talk to a Jewish woman. All right, a little less pure. Jewish man can talk to a Gentile man. Uh-oh. Gentile woman. No way. Jewish man touches an animal. That's not very pure. A Jewish man touches a dead animal. That's really impure. Menstruating women were below dead animals on the scale of purity. Okay? So if you have issues of blood, made you less pure than touching a dead animal. So the little girl is the highest of the high, and along comes the lowest of the low. Like this, when you meet this woman in Mark 4, she is the least human person we've met so far. She counts the least for anybody we've met so far in the Gospel of Mark, okay? So what does Jesus do? So she's the lowest of the low. She's been exploited by her physicians. So the kind of words that Mark uses here is not that these physicians tried really hard to help her. It's more like they abused her ignorance. And she's one of the ochlos, so she's been exploited by these people. And then what does she do? She reaches out and touches Jesus. And then she's healed, verse 29. And then what does Jesus do? Verse 30. Well, yeah, so what does he do? He stops remember, the whole crowd is moving towards the little girl. He stops the movement. And he says, who touched me? What is the first implication? What happens to the little girl as a result of Jesus stopping the movement?
She gets sicker.
Well, can you get sicker than dying? Right?
Yeah.
So Jesus lets the little girl die in order to spend time with the menstruating woman who's lowest of the low. All right. There is some politics here. There are socio-politics going on in here in this story. You are seeing Jesus's priority.
Yeah.
He lets the little girl die. He then focuses on this woman. And he feels power go out of him. Mysterious phrase. And then he says, who touched me? And then the disciples say, oh, look, everyone, the crowd is touching you. What are you talking about? Now, one of the effects of Jesus, Jesus, we've met Jesus. He can see into the hearts of men, and he can still storms, and he can know demons' names. Do you really think he doesn't know who touched him? Well, what he's doing, Mark isn't asking you to think that Jesus was ignorant of who touched him. What he does is he asks it, who touched me? And the result is this woman, what does she have to do? She has to step forward, right?
Yeah.
So she's a less than human person. Nobody who looks at her thinks she's a human being, basically. He now has created a space in which she has to come forward, and she has a voice. She's seen and she has a voice. And she has to own her own actions. Okay? So he focuses his actual personal attention on her. And he looks around, and the woman, she comes forward, which is significant.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to her, and then what does he say to her in verse 34?
He says, your faith has healed you.
What did he say before he said, your faith has healed you? You're overthinking it.
Daughter.
The little girl had a man to speak for her. She had everything going for her, right? This woman, less than human, totally excluded from everybody, has no one to speak for her. She has no family. What does Jesus do?
Brings her into the family.
Makes her part of his family. It's really good. It's a really good story. So he's made her human. He's created a human where before there was none. And now he's included her in his family. And he says, your faith has healed you, which doesn't mean because you could think hard enough. It's you came forward, your willingness to be seen to be with me, your desire to reach out and be with me.
Your recognition who I am.
Healing has come to this place. So he says, what happens is she has faith in him, and then he puts his cloak around her, as it were, and says, daughter, he has faith in her. He's like, you're willing to be seen to be with me. I'm willing to be seen to be with you. Right? Like, this is the climax of the story. I know we like to go straight to the little girl who's raised from the dead, but this is the actual climax of the story. And then just to prove that Jesus also likes rich little girls as well as less than human poor women, he goes and he raises her from the dead as well. But this is almost like an afterthought.
But what's interesting, not that I don't think this is about Jesus kind of, it's not about favoritism or loving the little girl less, but interesting, he doesn't refer to the little girl as daughter.
No, he doesn't.
Refers to her as little girl.
Yeah.
And it's not that I don't think he didn't think that he was, that she was also possible to be part of his family, but it's the fact that the woman who was bleeding had no family.
Yeah.
Whereas she very clearly had one.
There's way more. This is what I always say, like a healing is always also a social political act.
Yeah.
And this is the absolute prime example of that. Like, it's not just a healing. He's totally reconstituted her. He's changed her identity. He's publicly affirmed her. He's made her one of his followers. He's identified with her. He's shown his priority is with her. And, and also remember that the synagogue ruler is in some ways a form of an enemy to the ochlos. Even though they're both Jewish, he's kind of an enemy. Also, to run a synagogue under Roman occupation means you probably have had to compromise with Rome. So Jesus raising Jairus' daughter is in a way an act of enemy love as well.
Yeah.
So it's also political to the people who are watching it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more going on here than just some sort of whiz-bang tele-evangelist faith healing miracle. Jesus is going, this is my kingdom. Like, people relate to each other differently when they're around me. Yeah.
Mm.
And we treat our enemies differently, and we name our friends differently. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So as we close today, I can't believe we've already managed to make it through our time. 3 significant passages. Where do you think that leaves us today? As we began, we said we're in lockdown again and trying to reshape our lives in the way of Jesus. What does that look like for us? I'm struck by what you said about treating our enemies differently and naming our friends differently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, my first thought is I feel like I've got some enemies right now that I need to, like, not to put a too fine a point on it, but if you're a nationalist Trump supporter, you pretty much stand against almost everything I stand for. And you are my enemy. Let's just not to put a too fine a point on it. And what do I do about that? What would Jesus do? And I have to be like, okay, I'm starting to feel the offense now. I'm starting to feel what it was like to be offended by Jesus.
Yeah.
Because I really want him to be on my side. And then I think also in terms of like the lowest of the low, who's the least human, as it were, person? Who's the person that counts the least that I know in my environment? There must be somebody. Everybody has somebody who counts the least.
Yeah, who? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are people that we pass every day.
Yeah, and even in our friendship groups, like everybody will know somebody who's less valuable, who you perceive as less valuable.
Yeah.
Everybody should think about, who do they perceive as less valuable? All right. How do we show that person special honor?
Yeah, and bring them into the family.
Right, which is what...
It's not just, they become another friend like ours, but they are elevated beyond.
Right, which is what Paul says, doesn't he? In the early church, the parts with least honor we treat with special honor. And you can see they're working it out. They're actually trying to organize themselves according to the sort of stuff they learned from Mark's gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's my challenge to me personally. I don't feel it. I'm not like, I don't think it's fun, but I know that it's good.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
Well, I think this is, like you said, this is where the teaching of Jesus becomes offensive, because actually, if we're going to see this through, the challenge is as much for us within the church as it is outside. The challenge is as much for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus.
Right.
But it's subtle because we can rest on the religious things, the things that tick the boxes. We sing the right songs and show up at the right time in the right building. But actually following the way of Jesus should deeply challenge what I do with my life today.
Yeah. And it kind of does, it has to do with your identity. Like, who do you identify with, or who are you seeking to affiliate with? And so it's not even so much an action. It's just like, who are you willing to be seen to be with? And that's also part of what's going on in this story, I think. So yeah. Hey, can I just, before we close, my wife Claire, who some of people watching this might know Claire. You know Claire, don't you? You met Claire?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she was praying for us, for our group, and she felt like she had a word for somebody. And I wanted to just say that before we go.
Oh yeah, please share it, and then I'll pray.
I mean, it was very simple. It was that phrase, these boots are made for walking. And I just wonder whether there's somebody there who feels like they've been given a gift, but they are holding back from using it. And these boots were made for walking. So I'm going to just deliver that message and leave it there with an open.
That's great. I love the fact that Claire's praying for us. That's so kind.
Yeah.
Let me pray.
Yes, every time.
Jesus, we thank you that you showed us a different way to live. But we also recognize that it's really not easy to live it out ourselves, that there's so many things that we'd rather be doing instead. Lord, help us to treat our enemies differently. Help us to elevate those on the margins of our friendship groups and of our communities. Give them special honor. Lord, speak to us about what it means to give you genuine control and not just tokenistic control. And Lord, would you help us to pull out the powers and principalities that we see at work in our world, to give it a name and to cast it out, even if that means that we ourselves will be turned away from those onlooking because it's cost too much. Lord, thank you for the challenge that you have given us today. And we pray, Lord, that you would seal within us the work of your Spirit. And for that person with that word, if there's somebody listening today, if that's for them, Lord, I pray that they would have somewhere to go with it, and that they would step out in faith and with courage. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks
Wow.
for joining us, Stephen. Thanks for another episode.
Highlight of my day. Just waiting for this to happen. We got through the rest of the day so I could chat with you. It's always fun.
Well, it's great to have you with us. We've loved it. And thank you so much. And thank you for all of you who have been joining us. Take care, and we'll see you next week.